Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. UFC 279 Khamzat Chimaev versus Nate Diaz is this Saturday, and I'll be doing a bunch of prediction videos as well as a live post-fight immediately following the fights. But I wanted to make a video because I absolutely hate UFC 279, and I figured, I've made a couple individual videos talking about some of these topics. I've talked about it on live streams, but I wanted to make a dedicated video of all the reasons I absolutely despise UFC 279. And I could come up with so many pejoratives just to describe UFC 279 because it literally infuriates me. But I've narrowed it down to a top 5, and I'm going to go from 5 to 1. 5 being like mildly infuriating, and the number one reason, it just absolutely pisses me off, and it just drives me nuts, and it's going to piss me off even more come Saturday. So starting off with number 5, and the least of the infuriating reasons I hate UFC 279, is Khamzat Chimaev will potentially earn a welterweight title shot with a win over Nate Diaz. And I just think this is ludicrous. And I think you can make a claim that Khamzat Chimaev has already earned a title shot. He beat Li Jingliang, who was ranked in the top 15 at the time he beat him, and he dominated him. And then most recently at UFC 273, he beat Gilbert Burns in one of the best fights of the year. So he already has a claim to a title shot, but just the aesthetic of if he goes out there and beats Nate Diaz at UFC 279, and the fact that he may get the next title shot after Kamaru Usman, Leon Edwards 3, I'm just so sick and tired of guys getting title shots after beating Nate Diaz. Conor McGregor in the rematch against Nate Diaz, he beat Nate Diaz via decision. He got a title shot against Eddie Alvarez. And Jorge Masvidal beat him at UFC 244. That earned him 2 title shots against Kamaru Usman. And now we're potentially getting another title shot off of beating Nate Diaz. Leon Edwards beats Nate Diaz at UFC 263. What is his next fight? A title shot against Kamaru Usman. And I love Nate Diaz, don't get me wrong, but he's not a guy you should be getting a title shot off beating. I mean, he's won 1 fight since 2019, and that's against Anthony Pettis, who's no longer in the organization. Nate Diaz should not be in any fight where a number 1 contender is being crowned. And it's just kind of annoying because there's so many other matchups that could have been made for Khamzat. But instead, we got to watch him versus Nate Diaz and potentially get a title shot off of it. Moving up to number 4, and this reason actually does really drive me nuts, but it's farther back on the list because there's so many other reasons I hate this card. Tony Ferguson versus Li Jingliang. It's just a terrible matchup. I think both guys can win the fight. I think it'll be an exciting fight. But at the same time, there's no reason the UFC should be booking Tony Ferguson versus Li Jingliang. Li Jingliang is still ranked in the top 15 of the welterweight division. Tony Ferguson's on a long losing streak. Li Jingliang's coming off a knockout win over Muslim Salihov. It just really doesn't make sense. And it especially doesn't make sense because there's a litany of options for Tony Ferguson in his next fight. You could have booked the Conor McGregor fight. You could have booked the Dan Hooker fight. I mean, there's so many fights. Even Jorge Masvidal would have been a reasonable matchup. But instead, we get to see him against a power puncher like Li Jingliang. I just hate this matchup. And again, it probably will be fun while it lasts. But at the same time, there's just so many better matchups they could have made for fans for Tony Ferguson. And instead, now we got to watch a guy that's on, I think, a 4-fight losing streak now. We got to watch him take on a guy on a 1-fight win streak up a weight class. And I know Tony Ferguson has fought at welterweight before, but still, Tony Ferguson versus Li Jingliang is the last fight I expected, and it's the last fight that I ever wanted for Tony Ferguson in his next fight. Moving on to number 3, and this kind of has to do with Tony Ferguson versus Li Jingliang as well as another fight on the card, but short notice fights on UFC 279. I'm infuriated by this. Tony Ferguson versus Li Jingliang was made on 3 weeks notice, and also Kevin Holland versus Daniel Rodriguez was made on 2 weeks notice. The UFC was shopping this around to fighters as of 2 weeks ago. And these guys are not prepared for their fights, and I get they're always in the gym training. But there's a big difference between day-to-day training and getting into a training camp. Most of these guys like 8 to 10 weeks, and just 2 weeks, 3 weeks is not enough that they get enough training under their belt that they are prepared 100% for their opponent. And I just think it's not only shitty for the fighters, it's also shitty for the fans as well. When I look at a fight that I'm really interested in seeing, I want both guys at the best of their abilities. I talked about I didn't want Alexander Volkanovski stepping in for one of, Oliveira or Makhachev if they were to fall out at UFC 280 because I want them to have a full training camp for each other. Okay? I want to see two top-level guys with full training camps preparing for each other fight to see who's the better fighter. And I get it. Tony Ferguson versus Li Jingliang isn't for a title shot or anything. It isn't for a number one contender spot. Same thing for Daniel Rodriguez versus Kevin Holland. But I just think it's a slap in the face to just slop these fights on the card last minute because the card was looking atrocious at that point. I mean, this card was worse than a regular fight night before they added these two fights. And I just think it's unfair. They knew UFC 279 was coming up for months. They had it on their schedule. They booked the main event in Chimaev versus Diaz. And they waited till 2 to 3 weeks out from the fight card to book two fights. I just think it's terrible for everyone involved. And, then you have the case where one of these guys loses. They're going to be making excuses. They're going to be like, well, I only had 2 to 3 weeks to train. And then it just starts that whole narrative. And it's just downright annoying. Moving on to number 2, and this is a massive issue for me, and it was almost number 1, but the main event is a massive mismatch, and also the main event should not be a main event of a pay-per-view. You look at Khamzat Chimaev. He is number 3 ranked in the welterweight division. You look at Nate Diaz. He is not even ranked in the welterweight division. You look at Khamzat Chimaev, he's coming off a big win over Gilbert Burns, as well as before that, he beat Li Jingliang and dominated him. Didn't even break a sweat in that fight. And Khamzat Chimaev is this young, up-and-coming killer, and Nate Diaz is this veteran who's not even a career welterweight. People forget this narrative was built around Nate Diaz defeating Conor McGregor. Because Nate Diaz stepped in on short notice against Conor McGregor, they had to do it at 170. And after he beat Conor McGregor, which nobody expected, I picked Nate Diaz in that fight. People said, and Dana White said, well, Nate's just so big, and it was at 170. Nate went to 170. He tried 170 early in his career, and he got Kurt Angle suplexed by Rory McDonald probably 16 times in the fight. He got ragdolled at welterweight. And since Nate Diaz has kind of become a star, he's been fighting at 170, but against other guys who really aren't true 170ers. That's what's been going on for Nate Diaz. So this is a massive mismatch. You look at their skill sets, even Nate Diaz in his prime, and the Diaz brothers in general, they've always had issues with their defensive wrestling. And what is Khamzat Chimaev's strength? It's his wrestling and his grappling. He is going to ragdoll Nate Diaz badly. And on top of that, there's a massive size discrepancy here because not only is Khamzat Chimaev a big welterweight, he fights at middleweight as well. Nate Diaz is a lightweight who's just not cutting weight. There is going to be a massive size disadvantage in this fight. And I really believe that this fight was made 100%, and I've talked about this in other videos. I'll link a couple of them down in the description. This fight was only made because the UFC wanted to be vindictive towards Nate Diaz. This is the last fight on Nate Diaz's contract, and that I'm kind of lumping into number 2 as well. This may be the last time we see Nate Diaz. And the UFC did not want Nate Diaz fighting out his contract. So they tried to re-sign him. They tried to renegotiate a deal. And Nate Diaz said, no, I just want my last fight. So the UFC said, okay, you're not going to sign a new deal with us. We are going to give you the worst possible opponent we can give you. And that's why Nate Diaz hasn't fought since June of last year, because they've been offering him Khamzat Chimaev. And he's been turning it down. And when he turns it down, they automatically extend his contract. Well, now Nate Diaz realizes the game they're playing. He knew all along, but he was hoping he could wait it out. They're not going to offer him any solid matchups that are borderline winnable for him, unless he re-signs a contract. So they give him Khamzat Chimaev because they want to devalue him as much as possible on his way out the door. And it just sucks because Nate Diaz is a legend. I love Nate Diaz. I love watching Nate Diaz fight, but I'm realistic about his skill set. And he is not going to fare well against Khamzat Chimaev. And for a legend like this, regardless, I'm not saying give him an easy fight to win. Some people, pick easy fights, if they're a legend in the sport and this and that, and UFC tries to give him a winnable fight. I just want a fight that could be competitive for Nate Diaz. If this is, in fact, the last time we see him fight in the UFC, I wish it was, just a better fight in general. There's so many decent matchups for Nate Diaz. Why did they have to do Khamzat Chimaev? I mean, they literally are using Khamzat as a hitman just to destroy Nate Diaz on his way out the door because he refuses to sign a new contract. It's despicable. It's a massive mismatch, and it does not belong in a main event. This does not belong to be a main event of a pay-per-view. And, I get it. It's a big fight in terms of spectacle. But there's no way that this should be a pay-per-view headliner. This massive of a mismatch. And I just absolutely hate this fight. I mean, it's a terrible matchup. I get it. It's going to be fun during fight week if we actually get a press conference. I get it. But at the end of the day, we're watching a legend in the sport, Nate Diaz, most likely get massacred by Khamzat Chimaev. And even on the off chance that somehow Nate Diaz pulls it off, Khamzat gets injured punching him or something along those lines. Or if, Khamzat fades, that's the big narrative people are saying. Well, Khamzat could fade beating the crap out of Nate Diaz, and then Nate Diaz can come back and win. Then we have a case where now Khamzat Chimaev, who's in line to become one of the biggest stars in the sport, who's borderline already earned a title shot. Now he's been ruined by Nate Diaz on his way out the door. And, it's just, there's so many things that's just so unfortunate about this main event. If it was a co-main event, I could stomach it a little bit more. If it was a main event of a fight night, I could stomach it a little bit more. But this is one of the worst pay-per-view main events I've ever seen, especially since it's not on short notice. It's not like a fight fell out and they threw this together last minute. This is one of the worst pay-per-view main events I've ever seen. Moving on to the number one reason I hate UFC 279, and this reason really infuriates me. And before I even give you the exact reason I really hate this card, let me bring you back to UFC 229. And I know you're thinking, what does this have to do with UFC 279? But hold on a second. UFC 229, the main event was Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Conor McGregor for the lightweight title. Co-main event was Tony Ferguson versus Anthony Pettis. Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't have done Nurmagomedov versus McGregor. That was the fight to make at the time. It made sense. But it really was a slap in the face to see Nurmagomedov and Ferguson fighting on the same card but not fighting each other. It really hurt. All the cancellations, now we're getting them to see them both on the same fight card and they're not fighting each other. It hurt bad. And that brings me back to 279. The number one reason I hate it is we have Nate Diaz fighting in the main event. We have Tony Ferguson fighting in the co-main event. I've dreamt about a Diaz-Ferguson fight for so many years, and it would have been the perfect fight for both of them right now. And instead, we got to watch Khamzat Chimaev versus Nate Diaz, and we got to watch Li Jingliang versus Tony Ferguson. Why? Why? I'm hoping, honestly, I know somebody's going to call me crazy in the comments. I'm hoping for some reason Khamzat has to pull out of the fight, and they move Tony Ferguson to the main event, and we get Ferguson versus Diaz. Because it really hurts. It really cuts deep. The fact that we're getting two legends in the sport like Diaz and Ferguson on the same card at 170, it makes perfect sense to match them up. But because of the UFC's pettiness and because the UFC just doesn't want to give Nate Diaz any fight other than Khamzat Chimaev because he refused to sign a new deal, this is what we got to deal with. Imagine a card where we got Nate Diaz versus Tony Ferguson co-main event. Main event was Khamzat Chimaev versus Colby Covington. I would be absolutely pumped for that card. But instead, what are we left with? Chimaev versus Diaz in the main event. And this is just truly disturbing. I absolutely hate this card. I'm going to buy it. I'm going to watch it anyway. But I'm not going to be happy about it. This card is just, there's so many reasons it drives me nuts. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Am I being over dramatic? Do you think I'm crazy? Let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments. Thanks for watching the video.